Thanks everyone who's joined us a little bit early. We'll get started in a few minutes once a few more people join us, but really happy to see you here tonight. Great to have you all joining us here tonight. We're going to get started in a couple more minutes. We're still just right at 5:30 and we'll wait for a couple minutes past the half hour to get started. We got about one more minute until we'll get started, but thank you all for joining us tonight. It's really nice to see so many people with an interest in integrated voter engagement and the future of our youth voters in California. Looking forward to having the conversation with you soon. All right, let's get started. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Benner. I'm the director of the Institute for Social Transformation, also a professor of environmental studies and sociology here at UC Santa Cruz. I'll be moderating tonight. This is the third in our election series, co-sponsored with the UC Santa Cruz University Forum, an ongoing series focusing on the relevance of research at UC Santa Cruz to the broader community around social, economic, environmental, political issues, and proudly featuring the impact of research conducted by faculty at UC Santa Cruz. And for those who don't know, the Institute for Social Transformation has a mission of supporting innovative scholarship that changes the world. So that's what we're here for tonight, is to talk about elections and people changing the world. I want to thank all the people who are involved in helping to make this event happen tonight. There's lots of people behind the scenes, just so you all know. I want to thank them all. And then just a few pieces of housekeeping before we jump in. There's no chat function in this webinar tool we're using tonight, but we really want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions, and we'll try and answer them and really engage with them as part of a conversation. And so please use the Q&A tool that's at the base of your Zoom screen, and you can ask a question at any time, and we'll take a look at it and try and incorporate it into the conversation. And then also tonight's event will be recorded. So to get into the substance, again, for those of you who may be joining us just for the first time out of these three series, the overall series is really designed to look at the broader context of this upcoming election. So not focused just on the specific choices that are facing us on November 3rd, and even now, people are already voting, and hope those of you who can are voting now as you can. But also trying to look at the broader demographic changes, social movements, and political institutions that have shaped the moment that we're in, as well as shaping the choices that we have on this election and the choices that we don't have, as well as thinking about what are the new political possibilities of this moment in the context of the tremendous movement for racial justice that's been energized in the last year, and we've seen protests for racial justice all over the country in a way that's been unprecedented, as well as thinking about the consequences of the pandemic, climate change, unprecedented president. And I will highlight, just to introduce the topic for tonight, some of you may have noticed that our original title for this series was Elections, What Are They Good For? ? We've slightly changed it to say Elections, What They Are Good For, in part to emphasize, because we always thought elections were good for some things and want to encourage people to engage and be part of those elections, but also to highlight that there are people who have been structurally marginalized from our political process, and we have to understand that, and people that have been left out and don't see themselves in the political process and leadership in this country. And that's really our focus tonight, trying to think about California, recognizing the increasing demographic changes in our state, increasing communities of color across the state, growing Latino population in particular, but also very multiracial in big parts of the state, and many populations that have been historically marginalized from our political process and much less engaged, and particularly looking at youth and youth engagement in political life and civic life. And I have to say, we have a real all-star panel joining us here tonight, and I will very briefly introduce them, but I really encourage you to look at their biographies that are on the website for this event, and I'm putting it in the chat right there to take a look. So we're joined tonight by sociology professor from UC Santa Cruz, Veronica Terriquez. We're joined also by a Ph.D. student in the politics program here at UC Santa Cruz, Randy Villegas. We're joined by Ines Garcia, who is Oaxacan by blood, but from Merced by heart, Mercedian by heart. And she received her BS degree in management and business economics from UC Merced, and is a former youth organizer with 99 Roots. And she'll tell us a bit more about their really important work in the Central Valley in particular. We're joined tonight also by Martin Higuera, the son of immigrants from Mexico, but a lifelong resident of Bakersfield, California. He's a high school student who's been very active in voter registration, and the founder of Young Democrats clubs across the Kern High School district. And then our final panel member is Mindy Romero, who's the founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC, that's University of Southern California. But she also has long-term ties with the University of California system, including a PhD in sociology from UC Davis. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us tonight. And I'd like to start with you, Mindy, just to give us a bit of context here and really help us understand what are the recent demographic changes we've seen in California, and what does that mean for patterns of voting, in particular for youth voting in the state?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Chris. Can you hear me okay? Good. Always got to check. Thanks for having me. So let's start. I mean, it's probably not going to be a surprise at all to anyone, listening today, watching today, to know that California has changed a lot when it comes to its racial and ethnic makeup. It's also changed, by the way, in terms of the percent of the population that is young, that's 18 to 24, which I'll talk about in a second. So if we look over the last 30 years or so or plus, if we go back to actually 40 years, 1980, the state was 90% white, non-Latino, non-Hispanic. It had about 19% Latino. It had, I think, about 5 or 6%, 7% Asian American. And then particularly in the 1990s, largely because of immigration, although also higher birth rates, we saw a real kind of jump in the percent of the population that was Latino and Asian American, but particularly Latino. And today in 2020, about 40% of the state's population is Latino, another 14.5% Asian American. African American population, if you don't know, is much smaller in California than it is in other states. It's about 6%, but still significant in absolute numbers, of course, because we're a very large state. And so that pie, that racial and ethnic kind of makeup has changed significantly, and it has impacted elections. I'll talk about young people in a second, but just if we look at the share of the vote, over that same time period, also changed, actually, and I think I misspoke a moment ago, California back in 1980 was 66, about 2/3% white, but 90% of the vote was white. And so what does that mean? It's late in the day, so sorry. What does that mean? Why that difference? Largely because we have pretty significant disparities in turnout rates. And I think some of our other panelists are going to talk about that, so I won't jump into that. But certainly turnout is lower for Latinos and Asian Americans, and for young people, very much so. But even with lower turnout rates, the percent of the vote that is of color in our state, particularly Latino, has grown significantly. It's not representative. If you look at the share of the vote, so in the most recent general election, 2016, Latinos were about 22% of all voters. They were about 38% back then of the state's population. About 28% of the state's eligible voter population. So still not, the share of the vote isn't numerically representative of the Latino share of eligible voters. That's because of those turnout disparities that I mentioned a moment ago. But still, we're seeing, even with lower turnout rates, a larger pie, right, to pull from. Latinos are an ever-growing share of the voting electorate, and have also had a significant impact, growth in legislative representation and leadership in the state legislature. Still not a Latino governor, but still significant changes. Let me talk just really quickly about young people. So we hear about all this growth, but actually 18 to 24-year-olds have been declining as a share of the state's population, particularly in the last decade. And, for the next few more years, declining in actual numbers, and then still it's projected by the California Department of Finance for at least another decade, declining in their proportion of the state's population. For the last few years, actually declining in actual numbers, while the state is growing. Literally that population of, think about eligible voters that are age 18 to 24 that are citizen eligible to vote, their share, and of course, you don't have to be a citizen to participate in our political democracy or even in the election. You can support in many ways and be part of that process. But anyway, that share has declined. So that means it's harder for young people to have a voice because their numbers are declining. And when we talk about turnout is much lower for those 18 to 24. In 2018 general election, it was 28%. For Latino youth, it was about 22%. If Latino youth of low income background, even lower. So growing numbers, growing influence, but still not a representative, not fully represented at the ballot box in the political dynamic. Still a ways to go, but still very influential.
Mindy, your research, one of the things that really struck me was a figure you had from the 2014 midterm election about the percentage of eligible Latino voters of 18 to 24 who actually voted. And I wonder if you can repeat roughly that statistic, because it's a really eye-opener.
It is. Yeah, sorry. It really taught me a lesson about the power of one simple data point, right? So the percent of eligible 18 to 24-year-olds, those that were eligible to vote, only 8% actually turned out to vote in the 2014 general election.
That's all youth voters.
Yeah, 18 to 24, regardless of race, ethnicity. Youth of color, even lower. Latino youth, even lower. Now, you have to take into account that year was a record low turnout rate for everybody. Only 31% of all eligible voters turned out, but only 8% of youth, because when the turnout is lower, usually that it's lower for everybody, but usually it's disproportionately negatively impacts historically underrepresented groups. But even in 2018 general election, when that was historically a good midterm year election turnout, youth were 28%. So they're always, at least 30, 20, 30, 40 percentage points lower than older age groups in their turnout, if it's a higher turnout year.
Right. Well, and Ines, I want to turn to you now as someone sort of coming of age in the Central Valley during that time period that I just pointed to of 2014 up to 2020 today. And tell us a little bit about your own experience and your experience with 99 Roots and becoming engaged in a political process. Why have you and your peers not been engaged, and what makes a difference in getting people engaged?
Yeah, so thank you, Chris. Can y'all hear me good too?
Yeah, thank you for checking.
And so, Chris mentioned, I grew up here in the Central Valley. I'm from Oaxaca. And I think, the Central Valley is really rich in culture and diversity, but yet lacks a lot of like resources, very conservative as well. And not a lot of like those that are in office, like in the city council or the school board, represent like our demographic, especially those that like indigenous, Black, youth of color or folks of color, our demographic. So I think that's why it's really important, like the work that 99 Roots Power California, which is like 99 Roots is the program here in the Central Valley of Power California. It's really critical that what they're doing, the kind of work, because they are transforming young voters and making sure they're engaged, Black and brown young people, building that governing body. And I think like if all of California, if the Central Valley shifts or changes, definitely the whole California is going to shift, because what we see here in the Central Valley, it's a lot of like pro ag business owners, also very white. We don't see a lot of like, those folks of color owning the business or ags. A lot of it's also very like profit over people, and we want to shift that. And I think young people are really aware of all the things because they're the ones at the front line, their families. A lot of these folks are children of immigrants, right? So most of them also come from like a mixed status family, and they're first generation voters. So I think for a long time, not having someone like parents voting in a regular basis, I guess, like with elections, a lot of them, it's self-taught as well. But they're really energized around with everything that's affecting them, especially right now in this upcoming election. It's one of the biggest ones. And I've seen it, like, they're so knowledgeable because of other lived experiences. They're the ones leading. And I think I was able to learn with them. They were helping me to learn with them, like, just I was there for support, but making sure, like, that they're the ones holding their representatives accountable. And I think that's what a lot of these young folks needed, is just like the support, the guidance, but they have very knowledgeable, very energized, and making sure there's a change here in the Central Valley. Like I said, if the Central Valley changes, all of California is going to change.
I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about 99 Roots and what it refers to for people who may not know the Central Valley, and a bit about its history and its link with Power California and the work that it's been doing. It's really important.
So 99 Roots started back in 2017, 2018. It's a program here in the Central Valley, empowering young and building youth of color, Black, Indigenous youth of color, making sure those that are come from underserved, low income, first gen students as well, and ages 14 through 24. Empowering them, making sure that they're the ones leading in their communities, voting and organizing. So a lot of it's grassroots organizing, where they're the ones, holding these meetings for like with their school board members. So a lot of it consists of like a lot of these youth created chapters at their high schools, creating that space, mobilizing their peers, and a lot of the organizing, it's also like peer-to-peer outreach. Same for electoral, like they're calling registered voters, phone banking, making sure that they come out to vote. for every election volunteering. And I think that's where also, like, as they're calling these registered voters, we're also like young voters, they can identify, right? And I think that's where it's like it's so important and critical for the peer-to-peer outreach.
That's great. Thank you. And Martin, I'd like to bring your voice in here as a, as a high school student, and you're working to get people registered even before they might be eligible to actually vote. And I'd love to hear your perspective on what you're finding in working with high school students gets them engaged in a political process. What are you talking to them about that gets them interested?
Yeah, so first I wanted to say that I agree with everything she said. It's 100% true, especially the point about how young people aren't dumb. Like, we realize the corruption, the blatant corruption within our government, and our public officials frankly don't work for the people, and they work for corporations most of the time. And young people see that more than any group. And so I do a lot of organizing within the Democratic Party, and a lot of times, a lot of Democrats have the mindset of vote blue no matter who. And I just want to completely reject that. It does matter who the blue is. If it is a corporate Democrat that is just as bad as a Republican, frankly, we should support primary challenges to get the most progressive Democrat, because we do see that young people overwhelmingly support progressive policies and progressive politicians like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and many others. So if we want to, it'd make our jobs a lot easier if we had great candidates that energized young people, and we could present those candidates to people when we're asking them if they want to sign up to volunteer, if they want to vote. So yeah, it'd be great if we could get good candidates. That would help a lot getting younger people out. And I'd also say that it's not a radical idea to suggest lowering the voter age to 16. There's a lot of support for it among young people, and at least those who pay attention to it and have an opinion on it. And I think it'd be an amazing opportunity to start getting more younger people involved, because they'll see that they'd actually have the ability to make change by being able to cast a vote.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that move to lower the voting age to 16. My understanding, there's been some organizing around the state amongst youth and their allies to push for that. Can you give us a sense of what kind of organizing has been going on around that and what the implications of it are?
Yeah, so I know there is a proposition on that it will be on the ballot in California to lower our voting age to 17, I believe. I'm not familiar with all of the different aspects of that. I haven't been involved with that push. I would prefer 16 to be the voting age, but I understand we have to compromise to get something. But I'm completely in support of the proposition that that is proposing that we move to the voting age to 17 in California. I think that'd be a great step in the right direction.
Ines, did you want to say anything more about that? I know 99 Roots and Power California have had some involvement in organizing for that.
Yes, actually, I think they just posted the link to the voting, expanding the voting age to 16-year-olds. So there's been talks about it. Also, I know that I believe last year there was AC 8, which was like expanding voting rights to 17-year-olds. But I think expanding it to 16-year-olds, it's like more crucial, because that's like at that stage, a lot of folks that they're already aware, right? They already know, and a lot of them right now, currently, they're the ones like at the front lines, like I mentioned. They're the caretakers, their families, they're the ones that are. I've gone to the grocery store, for my parents, because they're older, so they can't, right? And all that I see, mostly the cashiers, everyone there, it's young people. So there's been going in, most of them they're in favor of this because they know how important it is for them, for their families, especially like those that aren't able to vote. Like they're for a long time, a lot of like our folks, like incarcerated people, our undocumented community, our youth, they have been exempt from not voting, right? So I think there's that movement already happening. I agree with Martin saying that it would be best if we expanded to young voters, those that are 16, because they're aware already.
Randy, I want to bring your voice in here a little bit and ask you to tell us a little bit about the research you've been doing on youth engagement in the Central Valley and sort of your perspective on what's been happening over the last decade and youth getting involved and what makes a difference there.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I do that, I just wanted to clarify the ballot, the proposition on the ballot this year is to give 17-year-olds permission to vote in the primary election as long as they turn 18 years old before the general election. You know, I think Mindy called this one a no-brainer. I really hope it passes, but I definitely agree with both Ines and Martin in saying that, you know, we need to lower that voting age to 16-year-olds because as we're seeing, you know, not only in the Central Valley, but across the state, we're seeing young people getting involved at, you know, unprecedented levels. You know, I've been very fortunate to work with Dr. Terriquez, along with some outstanding undergraduates at UC Santa Cruz and UC Merced, as part of the Central Valley Freedom Summer Project in 2018, where young people spent their summers, you know, in the blistering Central Valley heat, registering young voters, getting them involved, leading educational, nonpartisan workshops, and letting youth know, you know, and guiding them through the process of this is how you register to vote. And, you know, as Ines mentioned earlier, we have a lot of mixed status families and a lot of immigrant families within the Central Valley. And so it's crucial to have that education, right? And to have folks there to connect with them because, you know, traditional political science teaches us all about how, you know, young people who grew up in a family that votes are significantly more likely to vote, right? They're significantly more likely to be socialized. They have that person setting an example. And as Mindy mentioned, there are ways that, you know, folks who are not citizens can participate, but you know, they're banned from so many traditional aspects of participating. You know, they're banned from donating by the federal elections commissions. They can't register to vote and they can't vote themselves. So it's hard to tell, you know, a 16, 17, 18-year-old, hey, this is why it's like, here's your ballot, you know, go fill it out. And then they're kind of looking at you like, what is this? You know, what you expect me to fill out this double-sided, you know, super long ballot with all these numbers and propositions that even political scientists sometimes have difficulty understanding. Right. And so it's crucial to have that political education for young people. So they're empowered to participate and to speak up on behalf of their communities and oftentimes lift up and cast up their ballots when their own family members can't or their own community members can't. And so it's very crucial. And I've been really excited to see all the amazing things that a lot of youth organizing groups and community-based organizations throughout the Central Valley in California have been doing to do just that, which is empower young people and allow them to really lift their communities up. And it's such an amazing shift to see young people not only you know, participating, voting at higher rates or registering others, but even running for office themselves. And so it's very crucial, it's very necessary, especially because that question of representation, particularly in areas like the Central Valley, is very difficult. You know, Ines talked about school board members and local elected officials. Just over the last summer, you know, the last couple of months, there's been at least 2 to 3 school board officials who resigned in the Central Valley for very problematic and racist comments. And so it's very important for community members to see themselves reflected in positions of power and represented appropriately.
So Randy, I want to ask you a question, and others can chime in too, about California in the national context in this moment. And you all have talked about the importance of youth in California, Latino youth in particular, representing their broader communities and the ways that people participate in their communities, whether they're documented or not, in all sorts of different ways. And we're also in a context where we have an incredibly anti-immigrant sentiment being expressed by the President of the United States and really xenophobic sentiments being expressed in many parts of our state as well as the country as a whole. How has that affected political engagement by youth in the state, and to what extent is that a motivating force for getting people involved?
Yeah, speaking personally from from my own research, talking to youth in the Central Valley, it's been a bit of a mixed results in the sense that some youth are very motivated to take action, and cast their ballot and vote. But at the same time, I've had youth talk to me about how, certain family members don't go out and drive after 6 p.m. or that they have other family members who are documented run, household errands, the fear and the mistrust of local police who are often at the border wall, for photo opportunities with the presidents. But in many ways, a lot of youth have already told me that, they were living in a Trump era before Trump, right? Because a lot of local elected officials espoused their anti-immigrant views long before Trump came into office. And so I think in many ways, this year, 2020, marks a large shifting point, and in many ways, a possible test and referendum on the California we knew in the 90s. We have a proposition on affirmative action this year, and looking back at some of that exit polling data, I was looking it up for a class. It was the majority of Caucasians that voted to pass this ban on affirmative action, right? And a majority of people of color who voted, strongly opposed it. But as Mindy alluded to earlier, right, 90% of the vote back then was white voters. And so in 2020, are we going to see a change? Maybe, maybe not. We've gone full 180 in terms of, anti-immigrant propositions like Prop 187 back in the day, and Governor Pete Wilson, to California now declaring itself a sanctuary state for immigrants. And so, but as Martin alluded to, so clearly we still have a lot of, politicians on both sides of the aisle who are increasingly, very moderate in their positions, whether that's, when it comes to business or regulations on the environment. And so I think California is going to become a battleground in the next couple of years, and not only this year, but that in many ways will shape the precedent for other states across the nation. I hate to use the cheesy, as California goes, so goes the nation, but in many ways it's true in certain aspects. And so I'll let others chime in on their thoughts here.
Well, and there are people now, including some of our longtime friend Manuel Pastor, but now the governor also, who's saying California is the U.S. fast forward in terms of many of these changes. But Veronica, I want to give you a chance to get into this conversation and to feel free to answer any of those other questions. But you have two reports that have come out very recently, one on Los Angeles youth engagement and the other one on Orange County youth engagement. So I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about some of the geographic differences in the state and how what's going on in the Central Valley may look similar to or different from our urban centers in the state.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. So I think it's great to have three people from the Central Valley talking about their experiences in a pretty conservative part of the state where, as Randy had mentioned and the other two panelists had alluded to, there's some voter repression that occurs in places like Kern County and in Merced County, where there is efforts to kind of limit voter registration and outreach, particularly to young people of color. And that's not necessarily the case in other parts of the state. So recently published a report with Stephen Carmona Mora, who is a UCSC graduate, on the LA youth vote. In LA, turnout increased by over 400% between the very low 2014 numbers that Mindy's work has showed to 2018. And part of that, of course, had to do with the national context. Young people across the country are getting increasingly interested in voting because of all the national political conflict. However, there has been deliberate efforts, primarily led by young people of color, to register and educate each other. But in Los Angeles in particular, what we have found was significant support from the school districts, from other civic leaders to facilitate youth voice, facilitate the voter registration, inviting young people to host large assemblies to register peers. And that wasn't necessarily the case in the Central Valley in 2018 when we were trying to register voters. Young people were not allowed to go into their own high schools to register voters, even though the state allows young people to do that. So I think that there's incredible enthusiasm among young people to get out the vote and to register and to educate their peers. But it's really can be facilitated and supported by our institutional civic structures, such as schools, such as the county registrar of voters in LA County came out with the youth and deputized hundreds of them, helped train hundreds of them to get out the vote, and gave them material and made and distributed voting registration cards. In the Central Valley, it was hard to get a large stack of voter registration cards from the county registrars because they wouldn't give them to the youth sometimes. So it's a very different context. And it also helps that, LA has this huge school district. The school board members are mostly people of color and mostly supportive of getting out the vote and educating young people in a nonpartisan way so that they can have their own voice and develop their own opinions about what they want to see happen. Part of the push in LA was really pre-registration. Young people in California are allowed to pre-register to vote as early as 16. And this was really important because the high school environment allows young people to have a facilitated conversation with their teachers, with other youth around the importance of voting and educating each other around different propositions and debating them in a nonpartisan way. And so I think this allows a space for civic learning that doesn't always happen in households where people are working or maybe parents are not eligible to vote. And so to Martine's point about lowering the voting age to 16, yes, a lot of people are interested, but it also offers the opportunity for our education system to support youth civic engagement, young people's engagement in the voting process, because it is low. As Mindy's research has shown time and time and again, voter turnout is low among young people. But given the opportunities, given structure and support, it could increase dramatically. It increased by 400% in LA County, which is different than Central Valley. So it increased in Central Valley a lot because of extensive outreach efforts in the small little towns in the larger cities, but it was an uphill battle.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you highlighting the sort of informal ways that institutions and leaders of those institutions can both either encourage or discourage youth engagement. And Martin, I wonder if your experience in working with the school district in Kern, if you can talk about sort of what your experience has been with teachers, principals, supervisors in the district, and what has made a difference in you being able to get both voter registration and Democratic clubs being founded across the district.
Yeah, so to highlight Veronica's point, or to make it more clear, the Kern High School District is a school district that, just to help you guys get a sense of the type of leadership we have in Kern County, it's a school district that's been sued for racism and basically is lost. Before they had to settle because they were suspending and expelling students of color at disproportionate high levels when compared to Caucasian students. So the Kern High School District's leadership is, I would say, it's very bad. And they do not foster an environment that's accepting to trying to promote civic engagement. There's a lot of obstacles. It's been very difficult, but there are some sites within the Kern High School District that are good people. They do try to help out as much as they can. There are a lot of teachers that have given me so much support, and I'm very thankful for them.
That's great. I want to start turning to some of the questions from the audience, and also encourage you to continue to ask questions just to try and bring those perspectives in. One of which is really asking again about this moment in the pandemic. And any of you, sort of, what's your experience in how the pandemic is affecting efforts to get voter turnout and voter registration when you really can't do the same kind of door-to-door canvassing because of health concerns? And what other forms are people being able to reach out to young voters? And this is a question from Robert in the audience. So who wants to take that? Maybe Martin, I'll go to you if, you know, because you're living that context. How is your work being shaped by the pandemic?
Yeah, so again, jumping off another point that Veronica made, the fact that there's a social movement right now that's especially popular among young people for justice for Black lives. The Black Lives Matter movement is in large part all of the people who show up to their events, in large part that's young people, and mostly people of color, young people of color. And so that has really helped inspire a lot of students to take that first step and like showing up to an action. But the thing is, we just have to have enough people to try to convince or learning how to register to vote and teaching others how to register to vote too. And that's where we have some difficulty. But it is getting better. A lot of people, as I said, are being pushed to act. And that's better than before when they were just complacent, you know.
Does anyone else want to answer that question about how the pandemic is affecting voter turnout and engagement?
Yeah. So I think like the pandemic, what it has done a lot, it's like accessibility and education. For example, like for the voting by mail, you know, there's this myth going about it being like a fraud. So I think there's a lot of like accessibility as well for those folks that that are eligible but don't have access to it. Education, right? Like Martin said, or Dr. Terriquez, like a lot of the campaigns when it's like election time, uh, uh, folks go like canvas door to door. Now what it's happening is everything's being virtual, and also there's not a accessibility for a lot of folks. Like even right now we can see with like those that are doing online schooling, like for schools like elementary or K through 12, they don't have access to like internet. Parents have to work, so all of those things I think impact in a way, but also because they're impacting, there's a need to come out and to vote because they're the ones that being impacted, they're the ones that are experiencing this, especially young people. And I'm going to reference this again, like they're the ones at the front lines, they're the ones helping their parents, they're the ones translating, they're the ones that caretakers of their siblings, being teachers, being tutors, helping them financially, all of these things. I think that's what it's like very empowering. And there's a lot of energy of young people. It's like, okay, well, I have to do, I've seen it. And I've talked to like, as I also talk to young folks, they're like, well, I go to school like online, I help my siblings, and then I volunteer to phone bank to make sure they share on social media, they make sure they share all these content. The, like Martin said, the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement, they've, you know, done all they can, making sure they jump on calls meetings with their elected officials, holding them accountable on what to affect the issues of propositions. Like for example, schools and communities first, which is a proposition 15 that's going to be on the ballot. That money is going to come back to the schools, especially in the Central Valley where we don't have resources, we don't have the money. And like I said, all of it here that I've seen, it's like right now ag, you know, most of them are immigrants working in the fields, risking their lives, and they don't have protective gear, they don't have any protection or anything for them. So I think we see that, and I think the majority, actually Power California did a recent poll with youth, and their major issue, one of the issues that they really care about, it's like immigrant rights, right? Or like for farm workers here in the Central Valley. So I haven't seen that shift. And I think even though like the pandemic, you know, it's everything, it's happening virtually, there's still that energy. And it's pushing them more because they've seen like it's just hitting them more, impacting them more, I guess. It's been happening, like, all these issues, they've already been here, but I think this year, the wildfires, climate change, all the environment, everything that's happening is just like all together. So I think it's really important, and they've seen it. And even though there's not a lot of access, we're gonna make it happen.
Yeah. I want to lift up something that's coming out from this conversation and really turn, I guess, to Veronica and Randy about how it relates to your research, is contrasting what we've been hearing about, which I'll describe in a minute, with a typical voter registration drive that's been driven by the Republican or the Democratic Party, right? Where it comes around every election, sometimes every 4 years rather than every 2 years. They try and get people excited about whatever candidates are coming up, getting them voting and get out the vote work over the election cycle. And then they're invisible until the next election cycle. And you all are talking about situations where youth are getting engaged around issues through institutions and organizations that are in our lives, in their lives, in an ongoing way. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that distinction of organizing around issues and institutions in that long-term integrated way rather than just focusing on elections alone.
I could get us started, but I think you sort of point that out within the question itself. And I think the key thing here is that these youth organizing groups, these community-based organizations are about sustainability, and they're not about a specific candidate or proposition-centered campaign, right? They're really about identifying all these issues, right? And really using an intersectional lens to view how issues like climate change, wealth inequality, access to health, right? And going beyond the doctor's office, right? That definition of health is crucial to young people and their families, right? Whereas typical campaigns are focused on those, prime voters or high propensity voters, which are often white, wealthy, property owning, and much older voters. These youth-based organizations and youth organizing groups, target their communities specifically to talk to that voter who hasn't been talked to before, right? To talk to that youth of color who has never been contacted by a political campaign or a proposition campaign, right? And so I think making the key distinction there about, as soon as that Tuesday in November is over, that next Wednesday, they're working on asking the question of, regardless of who won, how do we hold this individual accountable and how do we get them to best represent our community? And I think the work that they've been doing, even within recent times, is amazing. I was initially worried about, having done some of this work myself prior to graduate school and within the Central Valley Freedom Summer of registering young people and filling out the forms. I was like, how are we going to do this, without being in person? And yet I've seen, so many different strategies of these groups really leading campaigns, whether that's, car parades or car marches, or organizing online virtually. If you don't mind me highlighting, Martin, I thought one of the most effective actions that I saw was youth from Sunrise Kern and a few other groups who attended a virtual town hall with a member of Congress in the Central Valley, and were really pressuring and putting on the pressure, asking them about Medicare for all, and in fact changed their screen backgrounds to Representative blank, please support Medicare for all. And so I think adapting to the strategies of the current time and really finding a way to continue connecting with youth and uplifting voices has been key for a lot of these groups. And I think the key difference between those political campaigns and these organizations is the fact that the sustainability is there, and that these organizations are embedded within their community and aren't going to pack up their bags and leave after that Tuesday in November, but they're going to stay there to uplift their communities along with the young folks who are involved.
So building off of what Randy just said, the youth organizing groups like 99 Roots, in Orange County, there's Resilience OC, there's Viet Rise working with Vietnamese youth. In Los Angeles, there's like 8 groups working with young people. One of the things that's really important is that they're trusted messengers, right? They're young people reaching out to other young people in a nonpartisan way, letting them know that their voice can be better represented, and making sure that they understand the voting process. There's this whole education that happens when they're doing voter outreach that young people are appreciative of. They appreciate just making sure that people got their ballot, that they know the process, and they're not being necessarily forced to vote yes or no or vote in favor of a particular candidate. Although that's not bad either, but I do, having studied the nonpartisan process and having done experiments on the effectiveness of nonpartisan voter outreach, I could say definitively that it increases turnout. And in particular, it increases turnout among first-time voters because nobody else is reaching out to them. The Republican Party, the Democratic Party are not reaching out to them because they think it's too much energy. It costs too much to outreach to somebody who does not have a voting record. However, the youth organizing groups build a relationship with young voters and make sure they vote for the first time, and then come back and follow up with them to make sure that they're voting for a second and a third time. And in addition to that, they're inviting them to events. They're engaging them in the mutual aid that's occurred during this pandemic so that they're community institutions and they do community building. And they tell young people, we want to hear your voice. We want to know what you want, how you want our leaders to better represent us. So it's about lifting up youth voice, not telling them what they should or need to be doing.
Right.
Maybe I'll just jump in just to,
Please.
to echo what Veronica said and give a bit more. I know she mentioned the research that she's done. I mean, there's been much research in the field that shows that the most powerful mobilizer for young people are fellow young people, peer-to-peer contact. And that's one of the things that is concerning during this time of COVID, because in many of the places where young people are coming together, typically come together, they're not able to come together, like school, like college campuses. Of course, college campuses are only a segment of the youth population. We often forget about that. But in any way that young people, I think typically when we talk about what research has shown us, we're talking about in-person peer-to-peer contact. It's the most powerful, and peer-to-peer by the same background, same racial and ethnic background, same lived experience, all of that. But in a time of COVID, we could still reach out. Young people are reaching out, and I haven't wanted to say too much because I really want the young people to talk today, because this is just incredible, all the work that they're doing. But we haven't, and I think it's been occurrent in what we've talked about today, but we haven't explicitly addressed the reason why the numbers are so low. And Veronica's absolutely right. A huge factor is the fact that young people are much less likely to get any sort of outreach or any sort of mobilization from campaigns and candidates that see them as not likely voters. Yes, not part of that equation, not worth it, not a good investment, all that good thing. It becomes this vicious cycle that young people don't get that outreach. They don't turn out again. It reinforces the narrative amongst campaigns and so forth. But we know that young people will turn out. It's not the fact that it's not about them being apathetic, right? Again, look at this amazing panel, but everybody that's tuned in today, they care deeply. It's an election system that excludes them quite deliberately and directly and overtly. Campaigns don't talk about issues that young people care about, and campaigns also, again, as already been noted many times, doesn't reflect the young people of today, and certainly young people of color. So you have to think about all the barriers that are in place still today for young people, from overt oppression in the Central Valley to subtle but very effective discouragement that we give young people on a daily basis, that parents give their kids when we don't expect young people to participate, right? And in many ways discourage them from participating, right? And just daily interaction. So we have an amazing group of young people here today that are doing just incredible, really important, needed work. But I think also to directly connect those low participation numbers to the work that we have to do kind of more broadly in the way our system addresses young people, let alone our schools, right, that don't support our young people and giving them the nuts and bolts, right? So when they turn 18, they know how to vote, the nuts and bolts of actually how to vote, and also want to vote. So I'll just stop there, but I felt like that was a part that I think we just need to really directly hit head on. I do a ton of research, year after year, election after election on young people, and the numbers don't change much. We see big increases, but when you really look at the difference between young people turnout of young people and older voters, the gaps are remarkably consistent and entrenched. There are amazing young people that are out there fighting the fight, but overall the numbers for turnout for young people don't move very much in comparable elections. We need some dramatic impact, right? To really change that needle if we really want to, you know, hit head on the underrepresentation that young people have. So it can be done. This researcher shows, but we just don't put the we don't put the
We
resources,
need to put the resources behind it.
time, and we don't put the army behind it.
Well, one of the questions that actually two different people have asked questions here that are related that I want to lift up, I think overlap with that, which is partially about how young people get information. So Catherine asked the question of typically how do young voters form their opinions from parents, peers, press, TV news, where do they get that information? There's also a little bit more pointed question from, I don't know if it's April or April, who says, the last several years we have seen a quote, war on truth. Including social media, you know, spread falsehoods that often get spread in bubbles. This is some of my language in there, but you know, in mirrored perspectives. And April's question is, you know, what do you see as efforts made by schools, students themselves, others, for searching out for different perspectives and collecting information from multiple sources to make informed decisions? So I guess it's really for Ines and Martin, I'd love to hear your perspectives is, you know, where do you and your peers and the people you're working with get information about what's going on in the broader society, and how do you try and ensure you're fully informed?
Yeah, I think a lot of it goes back to what Dr. Terriquez and Dr. Romero mentioned about peer-to-peer outreach. So all of it does come a lot from that. Like if you're, you know, talking with friends, talking to peers that are like-minded or that have experienced the similar situations through organizations, getting involved, getting engaged, having these organizations on campus, chapters on campus. For example, with 99 Roots, before pre-COVID, a lot of youth would go into to the schools to do voter registration. It would be nonpartisan as well, doing voter engagement, like, you know, providing these resources. We have a on-campus chapter, we have outside. These are some of the resources to get informed. Phone banking, texting, social media content by organizations as well. So a lot of it from there as well. I think for news outlets, not really, because a lot of it, I think it's depending on like our lived experiences, how we've been impacted as well. And, you know, doing with a lot of involvement with organizations, community organizations, grassroots organizations that are at the forefront doing the work. So a lot of that information there.
Did you want to add anything, Martin, to that?
Yeah. So I would say that the vast majority of my peers get their news from a lot of different social media platforms. And typically like the top trending story, like there's a list of articles that are talking about that, like on Twitter, for example. And then I know a lot of my peers, but the point I wanted to make about that is that it's really hard to combat that war on is to listen to what mainstream media outlets put out and base your opinions off of the facts that they report. That'd be the easiest way. But a problem with that is that oftentimes mainstream media outlets have a bias towards more corporate politicians in general. And when young people are only reading articles that are heavily biased and that aren't painting the full picture of a single topic or issue, it's really discouraging. And it's just another obstacle for young people to get reliable, unbiased news. And that's another obstacle that prevents young people from getting involved.
That's great.
Just to support what Martin was talking about, I surveyed young people in California in 2017, and they are significantly most likely to get their news from social media outlets. That's their main source of news. So we kind of knew that, but it's really, really high compared to any other sources. So social media is actually an effective way to turn out young people, and it worked in the 2018 election, and I suspect it's going to work in this election as well.
Thanks.
And just to quickly add, to some qualitative findings and work that I've done in speaking to youth, I think there is some sense of caution, right, or suspicion of young people from some mainstream media outlets. For example, a lot of Latinx youth that I spoke to over the summer were critical of stations like Univision and Telefutura, right? I think one even called them like telementiras, which is like lies, right? Essentially, and the way they were portraying the Black Lives Matter movements, right? Sort of highlighting, violence and looting and things like that to sort of paint a particular picture, while also neglecting the fact that, they themselves in the newsroom weren't inclusive to, Latinx reporters who are Black, right? And so I think there is a bit of divide in the sense of young people, being critical and, really being cautious about their news sources, double checking, fact checking a bit more than older folks that I've spoken to. But as somebody alluded to in the Q&A, right, we also do run a risk, and other research has looked at this, right, in terms of people getting into polarized bubbles or echo chambers, as they like to call it, on both the left and the right. And so I think, as we were talking about earlier, there is a critical need to engage in a civics education that teaches young people about how to engage in a dialogue, how to research multiple sides of arguments and verify their sources, et cetera. And I'm not sure the extent to which, our education system has tried to improve this, especially right now as everyone's trying to shift to remote learning and distance learning, especially in places like the Central Valley. Even being able to connect to the internet and the computer and to programs is a challenge, but it is something that should be increasingly looked at in the future.
So one of the questions from the audience specific to this issue from Sandra is specifically which social media sources. And if we're concerned about some of the biases of mainstream media, are all social media sources the same, or are there some that are better or more influential? What would you say to that question? Veronica, some of your survey work might have pointed to that, or I don't know, Ines and Martin, do you have thoughts?
Well, in the research I did in 2018, Facebook ads and Instagram ads increased turnout, particularly among people in their late 20s and early 30s, less so among the newest voters. And I think it's because they're on different platforms. So I think that, these platforms change and the popularity changes. So I'd be interested to hear from Martin or Ines or Randy, which platforms are being used most effectively now to register and educate voters, particularly those that are not already part of an organization. Because what I'm worried about right now is that these bubbles are very insular, and I'm not sure to what extent young people are reaching out to a much broader audience, especially when there's internet access issues.
Yeah. So I would say that, yeah, it's definitely the issue of these bubbles being created for people. It's definitely a problem. We know that social media or giant tech companies are literally profiting off of this. There's a documentary on Netflix, actually, it's called Social Dilemma, that I would encourage everyone to watch. It's very informative, and it opened my eyes to a lot of the terrible practices of the giant tech companies. But I would say that the main social media platforms that younger people use, like in high school, is right now it's TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, and sometimes Snapchat is in there too. It's used a lot.
So there's a question here from Bernard about the census Obviously, a major factor for allocation of government resources to communities will be the 2020 census. And has there been any effort to get youth involved in improving census response in Central Valley or in Southern California?
Yeah, I would say a lot of the groups, particularly within the Power California network, are actively engaged on campaigns to make sure that communities are counted. We know already, right, previously with other censuses that marginalized communities are undercounted when it comes to the census, and that greatly affects, the apportionment of funds, the congressional districts that will be drawn right later in just a couple of years, and so we know particularly for undocumented communities within the Central Valley, across the nation, the census was a big question, right? Whether there was going to be a question about legal status, right? And Donald Trump threatening to essentially through executive order ban the apportionment or the counting of non-citizens within the US Census, right? And so it is a bit scary in terms of, how many community members are going to fill out that census, how drastically is this going to affect congressional districts within California and other places. But we do know that a lot of these groups have been on the ground, actively engaged, whether that was phone banking, due to COVID, to encourage people, or text banking, encouraging people to fill out their census and to be counted and to let them know that everybody counts. And so there has been a lot of grassroots on the ground work by these organizations to ensure that communities are counted.
So Mindy, I want to come back to you and maybe others too. The question here is about what is the rate of voting in national elections among UC Santa Cruz students. So I don't know if you know anything about UC Santa Cruz students, but I think the broader question is really, what difference does it make college students voting? Are they voting at higher levels or lower levels than other 18 to 24-year-olds? And how should we think about sort of access to higher education in the context of civic engagement and voting?
Good question, an important question. I kind of alluded to it earlier when I was saying that, the changes COVID has brought on, and the fact that, college campuses are a typical place where young people can get together and share ideas and also be solicited, by campaigns and so forth if it's going to happen. But they're not representative of the total youth population. So those numbers that we gave earlier for turnout for young people, right, age 18 to 24, much lower than older voters. White youth and youth attending universities or college-going youth are overrepresented amongst young people. So we want to see, right, young people participate, period. But when we talk about outreach efforts, when we talk about voter registration drives, all those sorts of things, particularly outside of the elementary or the high schools, right, 18 plus, it's not reaching all young people. And it's a factor in why we also have a youth population that's not only low, but it's not representative of all of our young people. If a campaign, Bernie Sanders comes to a university, that's great, but he's typically not going to a neighborhood and talking to young people who are out of school and who are working for a living and taking care of their family, right? They're not going to a Latino community, or, well, in the 2020 primary, his campaign did do a lot of outreach in Latino communities, but we still needed to see much more by many other candidates and even his own campaign. So anyway, we don't see enough, period, even of college-going youth, but a lot of the conversation is centered around the needs and thoughts and reactions by college-going youth, if campaigns do pay attention. And that's a deep problem as well. Did I answer your question?
I think so. I mean, it was someone else's question, but I think so. Yeah, it gives us a little sense of it. I want to ask a couple of questions here that are coming from audience members that I think are a little sort of sharper about some differences and difference of opinions about youth voting. And the first one is going to be very specific to Santa Cruz, but I think has some broader implications. And the question, and this is someone who has their first name as just A period, raising the issue that there are many homeowners, longtime residents of Santa Cruz, who feel like students shouldn't vote. They're temporary residents. They don't have a long-term stake in this community. And there are obviously very large racial differences between the characteristics of young people, even college students at UC Santa Cruz, and longtime residents of the area. How would you answer that question? Maybe Veronica, I'll ask you, but I'd be curious for any of you who may face this challenge of yeah, it's really only long-term residents of a community should be primarily voting.
Well, students represent current students and future students. And students are a huge part of this community. And their interests matter. I mean, they bring life to the city, they spend their money in the city, and they're residents in the city. Even if they're here short term, they're replaced by other young residents. So it's really, I think, in my opinion, as a homeowner in Santa Cruz, that the voices and interests of our student residents are accounted for.
Chris, can I just jump in really quickly on that?
Yeah,
too?
and I should just emphasize that A period wanted to make sure that they did not agree with this view. They're asking how best to counter the views. So.
I just wanted to call out, and no critique of the person who put that question forward. I just want to call out that typically when we hear that kind of question or statement, it's really rooted ultimately in a form of voter suppression by age. So when we question young people's ability, oh, you know, they're not paying taxes, or I don't know if I want a young person to make decisions on my mortgage or my school, you know, my local bonds or whatever it is. Wait till they get older, they get more, you know, more experience, more common sense, you know, all those sorts of things. It's what we're doing is we're putting a measure on the worthiness of somebody's vote and whether they're worthy enough, right, and capable enough of voting. And that's consistent with a long history of voter suppression in the United States, where we would make groups like African Americans in the South prove their worthiness, right, to participate. A literacy test, for instance, right, a poll tax. It's a really slippery slope. When we start doing that, it's often motivated politically, or it feeds into political motivations, right? When you see those that are picked up and kind of amplified, an individual homeowner, it might seem like just an, you know, honest opinion or concern by that individual, but to really examine it, it's just perpetuating further those attitudes about young people that really just serve to further suppress them. And even young people pick them up themselves and say, oh, I don't know if, you know, sometimes young people don't vote because they care so much. They don't want to make a mistake. And they say, well, I'm not sure if I know enough for this election. I'll wait till the next election. And they're picking it up themselves, right, and putting that burden on themselves, that same kind of thought process that really serves to just suppress them. So I just wanted to call that out.
So this is a question going to Ines and Martin, I think in particular, and I'll say this is from W period, who's a Ph.D. profession. It has to do with youth vote and the 16 age vote. W period is a Ph.D. professional psychologist who says, you know, I can say with assurance that the human brain doesn't reach full maturity until age 25. So it's essentially an argument that, you know, until people are fully mature, they are easily impressionable and can be influenced in different ways, and is making an argument for we should really have 21 as the voting population. So how would you respond to that kind of concern?
Yeah, I think I don't recall if Dr. Terriquez or Romero mentioned this before, but it's a lot of like not, I think they don't get influenced. I think they already know what their situation, the lived experiences, right? So they bring that already. And it's not telling them like how to vote or anything like that. It's like they already make their own conclusions. So something that I do want to kind of like backtrack on, it's like what Randy mentioned about like Univision being a big like in the Latinx community, like especially for parents, right? That's their to go like media. But I think for young voters, they're the ones that are teaching, or you know, their parents are like, okay, no, don't listen to Univision, like this is actually what's happening. They're the ones that are you know, looking for the resources, making sure that they're learning themselves, that look for they just don't like, I guess, take any answer like, oh, you should vote like this because I think like this. I don't think they get easily influenced because they are smart, and I think they're already maturity, because most of them growing up at a young age, especially in our Latinx community, and I speaking for myself, I grew up at a young age, like interpreting, translating for my parents. So taking on those roles already, like babysitting, working at a young age in the fields, working at a grocery store. So I think like at a young age, you already mature, like you take on these responsibilities. And I think a lot of people don't see that. And that's for me, I'm like, they don't get influenced easily. If anything, they're the ones teaching us because they're so aware already. And they're like, actually look into this article, do this research, ask this person. So they just don't like look at any like social platform either. I know that they mentioned that right now TikTok or Instagram or Twitter, that's a lot of like the information. So they look at different outlets, or they at other organizations, ask people. So they just ask questions, right? So they question things like why is this happening? So that's my response.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah. Okay, so I would say, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I think the voting age used to be 21, and it wasn't until the 1960s around there when it was switched to 18. I don't know specifically what decade, but the whole reason it was switched from 21 to 18, if I'm not mistaken, was because people who were under the age of 21 still had to serve in the the military. They were required to. And the problem was that young people were required to serve in the United States military, but they didn't have a say on how to change the rules of our country. They didn't have a say in any of that. And they made a compelling enough argument to lower the age to 18. And I think we can use that same logic now to argue for lowering the age to 16. I mean, we allow 16, 15-year-olds to operate motor vehicles. These are literal metal killing machines. And we allow young people to operate these independently. And I mean, it's frankly, it's insulting when people suggest that we shouldn't lower the voting age because our brains aren't matured enough, and they won't mature fully till 25. I mean, that's true, but we see even millions of adults can be easily manipulated and easily tricked into doing things. So this applies to all people, and young people need representation in government too. I mean, it's the only right thing to do is to lower the voting age and give that representation to more younger people. If people care about trying to get younger people more involved, then give us a say, you know.
I just want to add, like, also it's giving them the option, right, for 16 years old if they want to opt into voting. So it's giving them the option as well.
Mindy, it looked like you had something to say about this too.
I'm just gonna back up, Martin. Yeah, 1971, first election, 1972, 26th Amendment gave 18-year-olds the right to vote because they could die for their country, fight in a war, right? Back to the person that posed the question was, with all due respect, I think my understanding is that the science is not in agreement fully with the statement that he made. So I think that could be contested in and of itself. And absolutely, also, we have lots of research in political science and political sociology that tell us that most adults, actually not a lot, most adult voters, most voters, period, don't put a lot of time into the researching into the decision-making process that they go through at the ballot box. A lot of that's because they have a hard time, especially voters from underrepresented communities have a hard time getting information and getting engagement from campaigns to get that information. But period, even longtime diehard voters, the biggest predictor of your vote is your party ID. And you may know nothing about the candidate, but oh, they're a Democrat, right? The old-fashioned pull that lever. They're Republican, right? They're neither, pull that lever. So for lots of different reasons, the bottom line is people don't actually make incredibly informed decisions and sometimes don't put a lot of work into it at all. And I often see young people who are excited about that new new right, who are putting a lot of work into it. They're either in school or just recently got out of school. Again, if the schools gave a better civics education system, and we actually put our money where our mouth is and supported young people in school and gave them the resources that they need to be able to get that research and to think critically about the election, but also while in school, right? Many, as opposed to many people that are years or decades removed from school, they can be debating, talking to their fellow students, talking to their teachers, and are often going through that process. And those that are doing that are very well informed, very engaged, very, very thoughtful. So again, let's give young people the support they need, right, to be able to do that even more. And often you'll see young people are even much more informed than older voters.
Yeah, and I want to add, I think, one of the main slogans to earn the 26th Amendment was, right, we're young enough to serve, we're young enough to die for a country, but not young enough to vote, right? Or we're not old enough to vote. And so I want to also emphasize that, practically all extensions of the franchise, all extensions of voting throughout the history of this country have always been fought through social movements, right? Whether we think of the Voting Rights Act, whether we think of women's right to vote, whether we think of lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, it all occurred out of, social movements, out of advocacy, out of efforts. And though I do concede, right, a lot of this argument of 25 to mature brain, right? I know a lot of people reference that in order to treat juveniles differently under the criminal justice system, right? We must understand that it's young people who are going to be dealing with the political consequences years from now, right? Whether we're talking about climate change, the criminal justice system, wealth inequality. And so in order to have young people engage and have them be less apathetic of the system, right? As Ines has emphasized time and time again, it's young people right now who are on the front lines and who are these essential workers, right? So where are the arguments of no taxation without representation, right? Where are the arguments of, not disenfranchising the young people who are working and literally holding this country together, right? Whether that's, working on the front lines of grocery stores or in the fields, or even young people who practically run Washington, D.C., right? You take a look at these staffers and it's not, people who are in their 40s or 50s. It's people who are recent college graduates, still in college themselves, college interns who are dealing with constituencies who are helping old folks make sure they have access to Medicare, who are making sure people are taken care of. And so I think that's one reason we should take a look at this issue, holistically, and treat youth as a whole, essentially.
And by the way, all those social movements that you just rattled off, Randy, of course, young people were the driving force in all of those. They were on the front lines. They were getting beat up. They were fighting at every step of the way for the society that we have today. Although still much work needs to be done, we can directly lay that at the feet of the work and the blood that was spilled by young people. So let's be honest there. And there's a difference between criminal justice issues and young people making a voting decision at the ballot box too. So that's kind of what I was getting at in terms of some of the debate there with the science.
Absolutely.
W's question has sure sparked a lot of response. Veronica, it looked like you wanted to add something also too. I thank you, W, for your question.
I also want to add a complementary perspective to what was just said. So neuroscience research shows that adolescence is an age in the life course where there's a lot of developmental growth. And adolescents are actually quite capable of intense and quick learning. And I think that's show that the activism that we're seeing today is reflecting that quick learning, because young people today are learning how to navigate political systems. There's adolescents who've been getting out the vote and explaining complex voting processes, complex decision-making processes around voting to older people. And it just speaks to their quick ability to learn and pick up things. And there has been research that shows that when young people, high school students, learn about elections in school and debate the different issues that are on the ballot, they tend to educate their parents and their siblings and other audiences. And so I think it speaks to the potential power of getting young people to learn about voting and getting them engaged in the actual process at an early age. because I think it'll have implications in their lives for the long term, but it also has implications because they tend to educate other people around them.
Peter in our comment makes the point too that it seems that 16-year-old voting would engage well with a high school civics class. So you could integrate into classes and hopefully get folks in the habit of voting throughout their lives. Thank you for that comment, Peter. There is another question here from Elizabeth, which is about in politics, sometimes the Latinx community has been framed as a quote, sleeping giant. And the question is, given your research, do you think this is a useful metaphor or characterization or a problematic one?
Well, there's several of us that done research. I'll just jump in because I often have to take this on. So of course it's problematic, and we really shouldn't even continue to use the term, but sometimes we're forced to, right? So it goes back to the note I mentioned earlier about young people not being apathetic. So one of the ways that we suppress or limit or discourage voting is to box and label in groups, right? So young people are apathetic, and what's wrong with what's wrong with youth today? Why don't they turn out more when we look at low turnout numbers, right? Oh, well, are they really worth the investment because they're just because they turn out? There's nothing we can do to get them to turn out. Well, again, we're not really doing what we should be doing. Same thing with the Latinos, right? The sleeping giant really puts the blame, if you think about it, it's putting the blame back on Latinos because it's saying that they don't, as a community, right, aren't living up to their potential. What's wrong with the sleeping giant, right? So I push back against those because all of that sort of labeling is again coming ultimately out of the same kind of corner, which is to dismiss or diminish or blame back, right, the group itself. And there are many reasons, systemically and otherwise, that produce low turnout amongst Latinos. It's not about apathy. And that's what we should be talking about, right? As opposed to labeling in that sense. So that's my 2 cents. Let others jump in.
Anyone else want to answer that question? So there's a very specific question here about poll workers, and we're sort of moving to wrapping this up, that many longtime poll workers, people who've worked at polling sites, are senior citizens who are at very high risk for COVID-19 and will not be able to work as poll workers this year. What do you all know about youth, encouraging youth to actually sign up to be poll workers for in-person voting in the California election? If you're 16 or older, you can serve as a poll worker. So it's a great opportunity.
So actually, when we did voter outreach at schools, that's something as well. Like when we partnered with the Merced County voter registrar's office, they would give us like applications, and we would take them to the classroom presentations, and we would inform them about it. Like there's these opportunities, and a lot of the youth would definitely take it, and they would also like become poll workers, because aside from that, they would also get like community service hours, or they would also get paid for the day, right, or be excused from the school. So they did engage into like, that was another opportunity for them to engage in these elections or campaigns through like doing poll worker, serving as a poll worker. And especially for those that are bilingual, helping with, like interpret or translate.
So we've got about 3 minutes left, and I want to ask us just sort of a final question for anyone who wants to jump in with a short answer, which is really thinking about the lessons from your work in California around youth engagement for the country as a whole. What would you say to someone in Florida or Ohio, or choose your state, about what lessons, both positive and cautionary, that California's experience of youth voters can offer them?
I'll say something real quick. I think the lesson from California and from my research is to empower young people to reach out to their peers, support their organizations so that they can mobilize their peers.
We could just end there. That's a great ending, but I want to give anyone else a chance to give your own lessons if you'd like.
I would just encourage anyone involved in the electoral process, whether they're working on a campaign or a proposition or they're doing nonpartisan work, is really reshift the paradigm, right? Shift the model, right? Who are you actually talking to? Whose doors are you knocking on? Whose phones are you calling? And if they're not folks who look like you or who represent the community, or you're not reaching out to underrepresented groups, then you've got to shift that model. Otherwise, we're going to be in this catch-22 cycle forever.
Yep, exactly, Randy. And I would also add that when talking to young voters, like, don't insult our intelligence. We're aware of the issues. We know what's going on. We know if you're trying to defend some BS, and it just treat us like how you would anyone else. We're informed more often than not. When we do decide to get involved.
Mindy, Ines, your last words?
Yeah, I think like for a lot of young people, it's like from volunteering to voting, they're expressing their views and they're playing a big role in making our communities better, for our families, for our loved ones, and for ourselves.
I don't really want to have the last. I don't want to have the last word. I would just say let's focus on the immediate. We've talked about long term as well, but this election, right? To try to break that cycle at least a little bit. Everybody plays a role. Everybody has a responsibility. Young people are the most powerful mobilizers of fellow young people, but we all can bring young people to the polls. It shouldn't be okay. It shouldn't be acceptable. We play a role in encouraging young people, making up some of that societal deficit. So your neighbors, your own kids, your family members that are young. If everybody did that, actually would change the numbers quite dramatically, but we don't. So we should.
So we should. Great. Thank you to all our panelists. Really appreciate the work that you're doing, most importantly, but for spending the time to share that with all of us tonight. Thank you all for listening and sharing in the conversation. We have one more in this series around the election, 2 weeks from tonight, if my math is right, October 19th, which is focusing in on our criminal justice system and efforts to reform policing and reform our prison system in California and the lessons for this election and beyond. So please join us on October 19th. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you all. Have a good night.